Hello, and welcome to Lecture 11 of History 361 at New Mexico State University, African American History to 1877. I'm Professor Bronstein, and today I'm going to be talking about Black resistance to slavery in the antebellum period. African Americans resisted their enslavement in ways large and small. As we saw in Lecture 9, one of these methods was to negotiate workplace agreements for things like overwork, or to refuse to be hired out to someone who treated his workforce badly. But even field hands and enslaved people who could not be hired out had ways to carve out autonomy for themselves. Before I talk about this topic today, I want to mention to you that the historiography of slavery is changing. Historiography is sort of the history of what historians write about a given topic. Initially, in the post-Reconstruction period, during the period of Jim Crow, a lot of the historians writing about Southern history before the Civil War were themselves Southerners. They were quite racist. And so you had what was called the U.B. Phillips School of Historiography. And Phillips's position was that slavery was a kind of school, that it was pleasant, it was good for the enslaved people, it marked an elevation of their status from their status in Africa. All right, so totally self-interested and quite wrong, but that was the initial sort of historiography. One departure from this was the writings of W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the first black scholars to write about slavery and Reconstruction, and he really questioned the Phillips School of History writing, but his ideas wouldn't catch on with the wider historical profession until later. After Nazi Germany came the writings of people like Stanley Elkins, who likened slavery to a concentration camp, saying it was a totalizing institution. It was an institution that really made slaves bereft of any aspect of their humanity, their culture, their religion, just kind of turned them into automatons or robots. So that was the historiography in the 1950s. And then starting in the 1960s with the influx into the field of African American scholars and women scholars and working class people suddenly becoming historians for the first time, you started to have a change in the focus of the historiography of slavery to look at sources that hadn't been looked at before. So, for example, to look at the narratives of former slaves that were taken down by the Federal Writers Project, part of the Works Progress Administration during the Great Depression, folklore, songs, all kinds of other cultural aspects were used to show that enslaved people had agency, that they had some control over the way that they lived their lives, even in the larger field of a very totalizing institution like slavery. So really one of the most famous books in this line, Eugene Genovese's book, Roll, Jordan, Roll, The World the Slaves Made. And that interpretation of what slavery was like really ruled the field for a long time. And so that is the interpretation that I learned. It's the interpretation that is in your book. And only recently has it begun to change again, with Edward Baptist and others arguing that slavery is just another facet of American capitalism, and that capitalism itself is extremely oppressive and horrible and a kind of totalizing institution, and that slavery was not some kind of paternalistic, non-capitalist institution, but rather it was an integral part of American capitalism. I would say someone like an Edward Baptist is moving away from enslaved people really having the ability to carve out any kind of autonomy for themselves. So moving back towards an Elkins-like interpretation of slavery. All right, so I'm going to be talking about resistance to slavery, and as I said, this is really based on the sort of Genovese style, looking at slaveholder records, reading between the lines of those records to try to see, okay, they may say the workforce was doing shoddy work or working slowly, but what could those things have meant from the perspective of the slaves? And in fact, enslaved people found many ways to resist their captivity on a daily basis, on an everyday basis. They stole from their masters. They pretended to be ill to avoid unpleasant work. They sabotaged tools or farm animals. And they temporarily ran away in order to avoid punishment and harsh treatment. Some would hide from their masters for days or weeks or even months. And so running away nearby was a common form of everyday resistance. Sometimes enslaved people would respond to their master's brutality with physical resistance. Frederick Douglass, a famous runaway slave and later abolitionist, was one such person. He exchanged blows with a brutal slave master and, quote, "Let it be known that the white man who expected to succeed in whipping must also succeed in killing me." While Douglass survived the incident, most enslaved people who resorted to violent measures risked death. A North Carolina judge ruled in the 1829 case known as State versus Mann that not just whites who owned slaves, but also whites who supervised slaves had the authority to punish, beat, or even kill rebellious slaves. Other court rulings reinforced slaves' subservience to white people. In 1854, Georgia's Supreme Court ruled in John versus State that any slave accused of killing a white person had to be charged with murder, even if he or she had acted in self-defense. Okay, so clearly not a judicial system that was fair. There were more serious ways to resist slavery, like running away to the north or to Canada, and some people found very ingenious ways to do this. Ellen and William Craft, who are pictured on the right side of your slide, escaped from a Georgia plantation in 1848 by passing Ellen off as a sickly slave master traveling north for medical attention. She wrapped her mouth so that it wouldn't be considered surprising that she couldn't talk. She wrapped her hands with bandages. She wore dark glasses. She really didn't appear in public very much on the steamboat that they used to travel to freedom. Her husband, William, pretended to be her slave and sort of her valet, and they made it to Philadelphia successfully. Another runaway enslaved person, Henry Brown, escaped from Richmond with the help of a sympathetic white shopkeeper. He had the shopkeeper pack him into a wooden crate and mail him to the north. Brown endured 27 hours in the box, which traveled by steamboat, rail, ferry, and delivery wagon before finally landing in Philadelphia. Slaves who lived in or traveled through states that bordered free soil states had a better chance of escaping. For example, Kentucky slaves could cross the river into Ohio and claim their freedom. Slaves close to what was called the Underground Railroad also had a better chance of successfully escaping. The Underground Railroad was a network of black and white anti-slavery activists who harbored and transported runaways, helping them to elude slave patrollers and catchers. But not everybody could easily run away. Most slaves who endured the journey north were childless, young, strong, and had already been separated from their families as a result of slave sales. Childbearing and motherhood significantly limited slave women's escape options, and running away was all but impossible with young children. And as you will see, or you will have seen already by reading Harriet Jacobs' narrative, she really was hampered in her ability to get away by having two children, by their relative youth, and not wanting to desert them. Another way for enslaved people to resist the terms of their enslavement was to insist on autonomy in the cultural practices that they had control of, including religion. By the early 1800s, many enslaved communities had embraced evangelical Christianity. They favored the emotional styles of worship that were permitted in Methodist and Baptist revival churches, but most of the religious training occurred in the slave quarters. Black people in rural areas often didn't have access to churches, and slave owners didn't always allow their slaves to attend church. Slaves who worshipped along whites or received religious instruction from them didn't trust Christianity because white ministers who preached to slaves often insisted on just emphasizing the parts of Scripture that said things like, "Servants, obey your masters." Instead, slaves developed their own brand of Christian ideology and practice, which historians have termed the invisible church. Enslaved African Americans gathered in secrecy and stressed biblical values like justice, freedom, love, and equality. They favored Old Testament stories about Moses liberating the children of Israel from slavery in Egypt. Slaves also gathered in their homes or in so-called hush harbors in the woods to attend religious ceremonies that incorporated African religious practices officiated by slave elders. Rituals called variously juju or voodoo were also an important part of some slave communities. And the ring shout tradition, in which congregants moved counterclockwise in a circle while shuffling their feet, singing, and clapping, is evidence that West African traditions survived in America. Enslaved people also passed important information, knowledge, and wisdom down family lines. As in Africa, slave elders were important retainers of knowledge. Literacy bans kept them from learning and teaching their young people to read and write, but they were able to teach them how to negotiate with their masters and how to survive slavery. Older slaves taught younger slaves agricultural techniques. Adult men taught boys how to fish and hunt, and women taught girls how to cook and care for children. On most plantations, tasks were differentiated by gender. Women were classified as 3/4 of a hand and were spared some of the most taxing labor. For example, during planting season, most of the time, men plowed while women wielded the hoe. When laborers were in high demand, though, women could be assigned to any task. In Louisiana, female slaves toiled alongside male work gangs, working 60 to 70 hours a week. And the amount and the intensity of work affected slave fertility rates in the region. The birth rate in the Deep South declined by 13% every decade. Louisiana's enslaved women had a meager diet of salt pork, molasses, and cornbread. This did not supply the nutrients needed to bring babies to term. Enslaved women also had knowledge of herbal remedies that they could use to abort unwanted pregnancies. So regulating fertility and not bearing children was another means by which enslaved women could resist. Wealthy Louisiana sugar producers could afford to buy new slaves when their slaves didn't reproduce, but most slave owners throughout the South could not, so they reduced workloads for expecting slave women. Some slave owners made no accommodation for pregnant slaves because they believed that black women were naturally immune to the difficulties of pregnancy and childbirth. When slave women were put back to work after childbirth, they had to juggle infant care and the grueling labor regime, but they still tried to exert some control over their babies by giving them separate non-slaveholder assigned names, sometimes with African origins that had meaning to the families. Southern courts didn't recognize slave marriages, and slave codes frequently prohibited them, but slaves developed their own codes and rituals to formalize marriages in slave communities. Sexual partners could also be imposed on slaves. One ex-slave remembered that her marriage began when her owner came into her cabin with a male slave and forced them to undress. Slave masters sometimes forced their slaves to to procreate so that they could multiply their profits through the offspring that the slaves produced. And slave women, married or not, were vulnerable to sexual abuse at the hands of white men, as you will see or will have seen in Harriet Jacobs' narrative. Some slaves elected to marry slaves from neighboring plantations. This practice was known as an abroad marriage. It wasn't super popular among slave owners, so slaves had to seek their master's permission to visit their spouses or risk being caught by patrollers while sneaking off to visit them at night. Slave parenthood was difficult. Children could be brutalized and disciplined by their masters. And once a child was weaned from its mother, his or her parents were no longer permitted to look after that child during the day. Even so, enslaved parents attempted to protect their children as best they could. Children were often insulated from adult knowledge. So, for example, they weren't told until quite late where babies came from, and they were instructed by their parents to obey their masters in order to avoid the worst punishment. In the final analysis, fictive kin relationships were often established in the slave quarter in order to kind of make up for the fact that enslaved families had a very hard time staying together. The fact that members could be sold away from each other at any time meant that it really did kind of take a village to raise a child. And so for children in a slave quarter, every adult was a kind of surrogate parent. That is why the women in the slave quarter were referred to by all the children as Aunt whoever, Aunt whatever her first name was, and the men as Uncle whatever. All right, so this was another way in which enslaved people could, within the ambit of, let's recognize, a very, very oppressive institution, carve out kind of a sphere of autonomy for themselves. The last topic I want to cover today is that of major slave rebellions. They are not as well known as some of the other kinds of rebellion because lots of slave rebellions occurred, but masters didn't always want to keep note of them or write them down. But we do know about some of them. One, for example, was the plot of Denmark Vesey. Denmark Vesey was originally from St. Thomas in the Danish West Indies. His first name was Telemark, and he came to Charleston with his owner in 1793. Vesey was fluent in French and English. He taught himself to read and write, and he worked as a domestic servant. In 1799, he purchased a lottery ticket with money that he had probably earned by doing extra work, and he won $1,500, which was a lot of money back then. He purchased his freedom, and he started a carpentry business with his winnings. He also maintained relationships he had with slaves, and like other African Americans, he was following the nation's response to the Missouri crisis, the crisis I mentioned in Lecture 10, and he was very disappointed in the outcome, which was really to do nothing about the future of slavery in the United States. So Vesey began planning a rebellion in 1820. He recruited enslaved friends and other slaves to join forces and raid Charleston's Meeting Street Arsenal and a nearby shop for weapons. He expected to be joined by thousands of enslaved people. He used the religious classes that he led as a lay preacher in Charleston's African Methodist Episcopal Church to review his plot. He likened his mission to the biblical account of the children of Israel enslaved in Egypt. Vesey and his comrades dreamed of sailing off to Haiti, but that dream was crushed when two people revealed Vesey's plans to their owners a month before the planned revolt. Authorities quickly arrested 131 slaves and free blacks. 72 were tried, convicted, and sentenced to death, while others died in custody and 27 were released. Vesey and 5 other men were hanged on July 2nd, 1822, as witnessed by thousands of white and black Charlestonians. Several other mass hangings followed that month. The rebels were denied funeral rites and proper burials. Authorities knew that slave burials were very important spiritual ceremonies for blacks, who believed that burial rites secured the soul in the afterlife. While the hangings satisfied the bloodlust of slaveholders who wanted to punish rebels and strike fear in the hearts of slaves, it should be noted that the executions were halted before they were finished because every slave executed had to be, the owner had to be repaid for the loss of their property. So 37 of the conspirators who were supposed to be executed were actually transported to slave societies outside the U.S. The legacy of Vesey's plot, like Gabriel's rebellion in Richmond, left a lasting impression on Charleston. In particular, new restrictions were imposed on free blacks and slaves to minimize the likelihood of future slave rebellions. State officials banned slaves from hiring themselves out, free blacks were banned from hiring slaves, 150 guardsmen were employed to patrol the city, and slaves were prohibited from traveling around the city without a pass. Slaves caught without a pass would be whipped or made to walk the prison treadmill that was installed at the Charleston jail in 1823. Free blacks were the subject of increased legislation and surveillance. An annual $50 tax was imposed on them, and free black males over the age of 15 needed to secure a white guardian in order to remain in the state. New laws also prohibited slaves from learning to read or write. Okay, so this rebellion never actually came to fruition. No white people were killed in the planning of this rebellion, and yet there was a huge backlash, 131 arrested, 72 sentenced to death, all but 37 of those actually executed, and then a huge backlash against the free black community. Today, there is a statue of Denmark Vesey in Charleston, South Carolina. You can see the statue being dedicated there. In the wake of Denmark Vesey's revolt, David Walker, a free black man, fled South Carolina and established a business in Boston. He was disturbed by the poverty and racism that he saw limiting the life prospects of Boston's African Americans. He was enraged by the American Colonization Society's plan to force free blacks to emigrate. He actively opposed slavery by harboring runaways and contributing to the nation's first black newspaper called Freedom's Journal. In 1829, David Walker published an abolitionist manifesto titled Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. The pamphlet became very influential. The work roused radical black abolitionists and was embraced by white abolitionists, inspiring them to shift their focus from emigration to emancipation. But Walker's call for violence was condemned by abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, who criticized, quote, the spirit and tendency of this appeal. By 1830, Walker's pamphlet had reached Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, and Alabama. And so it was seen as a kind of spur for rebellion. White Southerners were terrified by the pamphlet's call to action. They offered a bounty of $3,000 to anyone who killed Walker and $10,000 if he was delivered to them alive. Special meetings of Southern state legislatures were dedicated to undermining Walker's pamphlet and crafting new laws that would restrict blacks. Walker was found dead in 1830 on his own doorstep just after the publication of the third edition of his appeal. The cause of his death is unknown. He might have died of tuberculosis, which was rampant in 19th century Boston. Maybe he was the victim of foul play. $3,000 was a heck of a lot of money in 1830. We don't know. But this just gives you some sense of the way in which even free speech being exercised by African Americans in the North in this time period could be punishable by death. Finally, Nat Turner's rebellion. Nat Turner was a lay preacher, an enslaved man, who led one of the bloodiest slave rebellions in American history. He was born in Southampton County, Virginia. He grew up during the Second Great Awakening. He was raised in a Methodist household, and he spent much of his spare time praying and fasting. Turner had a vision that he interpreted as directing him to murder his master, even though his comment afterwards was that his master was not a terrible guy, didn't treat him all that badly. He had a vision from God saying this is what he needed to do. So on the evening of August 21st, 1831, Nat Turner and his comrades armed themselves with axes and hatchets. They traveled from plantation to plantation, killing white men, women, and children, and gathering more weapons and recruits. Ultimately, he was joined by 50 slaves and free blacks, and they killed 60 white people before a Virginia militia of white people, captured them. In response, white Virginians killed more than 100 black people, while another 48 suspects were captured, tried, and executed. So there was just like vigilante vengeance, and then there was a legal proceeding. Turner was among those executed, although he wasn't captured until 3 months after the rebellion. He was also allowed to give the story of his upbringing and his planning to a lawyer before he was executed. So we know rather a lot about the planning of Turner's rebellion. Certain that Turner's insurrection was the handiwork of radical black abolitionists, Virginia legislatures passed a colonization bill which would pay to remove free blacks from the state and prohibit blacks in the state from preaching or attending religious meetings. Southern lawmakers also, in 1835, passed a gag rule that silenced the reading of anti-slavery petitions in Congress for almost 10 years. For some people, the gag rule was evidence that wealthy Southerners had undue influence in Congress. Black dissent continued in the years following Turner's rebellion. There were 2 insurrections that took place on ships. The Amistad case that was made into a movie by Steven Spielberg was one of those. But as all of these rebellions and attempted rebellions show, it was really a box that it was very difficult to get out of, because even if one conducted a successful rebellion against slavery in a particular place, that particular place was subsumed in a much larger institution of slavery and a system of jurisprudence that didn't give African Americans a fair shake. And so resistance was pretty much futile, to put it plainly. Okay, well, that is it for now, and I will see you in the comments.